Hey, thanks very much, Mark. And look, it's wonderful to be here. I'd like to thank Atan very much for including Intel in today's event. It's certainly our pleasure to be here today, and certainly my pleasure to be here and have the opportunity to spend the next 15 or 20 minutes to talk to you about an area that is very important to Intel, that being the Internet of Things. Oh, my clicker. Yeah. So, my beautiful face. So the title of my presentation today is Monetizing IoT and Getting Infrastructure Right. And the sort of things I'll be talking about over the next 15 minutes is giving you a sense for where we are today and why we are where we are. But then I'll spend the lion's share of my time with you talking about some of the things that were mentioned by the previous speaker there in terms of the key considerations you need to start mapping into your decisions about IoT, specifically about when you start thinking about infrastructure, and how those key considerations can compress your time to monetization of the IoT service and data that you're delivering. So I don't know about you, but every time I open the Sydney Morning Herald, there seems to be a new technology usage model, a new type of IoT being promoted, being talked about, being brought to market. And this isn't, some of these usage models, particularly in the wearables, is quite new, but for Intel, this isn't a very new area at all. In fact, we've been working in things that were IoT related probably for the last 30 years or so. And that particular business unit of Intel is called our embedded group. We've now renamed them to a more modern day parlance for the Internet of Things group. But this particular group, they contributed $2 billion to Intel's bottom line last year. And what's interesting about that is for a $54 billion company such as ourselves, that's now starting to reach critical mass. But the growth behind that was 20%. So getting anything that's growing that fast is always very interesting to us. And we forecast for 2015 to be a similar sort of growth rate for us. So we envisage Internet of Things being quite a considerable contributor to Intel's bottom line over the next couple of years. But why is this happening? Why is this happening now? If we've been working on it for 30 years, why has it taken us this long to start bringing some things to market? There have been some key changes in infrastructure, and particularly in the cost models of infrastructure, that's made this happen right now. Specifically, the cost of sensors has come down twofold over the last 10 years. The cost of connectivity has come down, and the pervasiveness of connectivity has come down 40-fold over the last 10 years. And the cost of compute, which is close to Intel's heart, has come down 60-fold over the last 10 years. So those reductions have now made the technology and the capabilities required for Internet of Things available to not just compute-style devices that require heavy compute, but also down to wearables now. So an interesting side note on the cost of transistors. I mean, the transistors that we're creating now, these things turn on and off 2.5 billion times a second. So don't try that at home. And we can now produce these transistors for less than it costs a farmer to produce a single grain of rice. Just to give you a sense for how these things are coming along. So when you start compacting these transistors together to form something interesting in a processor and a thing, there's an incredible amount of power available to you at a very cost-effective rate. Where are we? I'm pressing the button. Here we go. Now, if I knew this slide was going to come out the way it was when I was creating this at home, I probably would have distributed 3D glasses for you all. But just for where this is going now, I mean, we're seeing all sorts of usage models bubble up just over the last 12 months with respect to autonomous vehicles, robots, smart cities. It seems like every month there's a new smart city tender coming out. But what's really interesting about this for Intel, and again, another side note about how we operate, is when you expose the fundamental building blocks that we produce out into a community of innovators, such as the IoT segment, who knows what's possible and what can be created. When we first created the microprocessor, we got a group of our best brains together into a workshop environment to start thinking about what is it that we could use this microprocessor for. And we came up with 18 usage models. Not one of those usage models was the PC. It took a third-party external company named IBM to come along, look at that microprocessor and say, hey, I think we've got an idea for you here in terms of solution. We call it the personal computer, and off we went. So who knows, hopefully somewhere for Intel inside one of these segments, in times of the maker community, for example, there could be our next PC revenue line. And then talking about the maker community, and this presentation is about infrastructure, why some of this stuff is starting to happen now is these economies of scale that are produced and the access to resources that are now available in the cloud and in big data, and indeed big data services across the cloud. And in the past, being able to invest in a data center or stand up servers to facilitate the sorts of services that we're seeing on the screen here would have been absolutely prohibitive for an individual innovator or a small, medium business as such. But now, any small, medium business and individual innovator can access these key pieces of infrastructure in ways that they would never have been open to them before. So in terms of some key considerations, when we first started developing our IoT platform, we started thinking through what would be some of the challenges to this platform being successful. Indeed, what would be the challenge to IoT being successful as a broad industry segment in any particular vertical. And some of these came from experiences in other verticals and industries that we've worked in, but a lot of these are very foundational to IoT itself. It's what we call our 5 tenets of IoT. I mean, the previous speaker touched on a lot of this, and I'll go through each one individually, and as I'm going through it, a lot of it's just going to sound like common sense. But for where we are right now in terms of the early stages of IoT as a segment, we feel it's very critical for us to be very explicit about what we believe in with these tenets and ensure that these tenets are adhered to in any infrastructure that you might be envisioning selecting for your own IoT solutions. So firstly, security is the foundation, both in the hardware and in the software, so that you can identify what's capturing data for you and identify it into your network, that it's a trusted source of data and a trusted device. Because as you start putting these things out across the world with 50 billion devices, you can imagine your attack surface for any perpetrator expands dramatically. The second area is connectivity, device discovery and provisioning. Broadly speaking, I would call this management. So when we start deploying these things out into our environment, and again, with 50 billion of these forecast to be landing in our environment in the next couple of decades, you don't really want to be managing these manually. You know, how can they be self-discovered? How can they be self-provisioning? How can you update them, for example, new security postures to make sure that these things are appropriate for your internet solution? Data normalization, what we're referring to there is essentially interoperability and standards that we're setting up with a number of industry partners, such as Cisco, for example, to ensure that these things speak to each other, that they communicate in a way that saves most IoT developers the hard work of having to figure out this themselves. Now, for brand new devices or things that are being produced, they will have these standards baked straight into them. But we have to remember there's a number of devices, of things that are already out in the environment today that we need to consider, and how do we bring these into this IoT segment. The next is actionable analytics. Now this, I guess, sounds reasonably obvious, but if you're capturing all this data, what are you going to do with it? What algorithms can you run over it? What applications you can develop with it to make it useful to someone somewhere? And finally, getting to the nub of it as to why a lot of us are here, is how do we start to monetize either the hardware, software, or the data management that we're capturing here. From the Intel point of view, you know, we certainly sit on the hardware and software side of that IoT equation. Probably for many of the startups and innovators in IoT today, they'll be most certainly focused on that data management side. And the key here is understanding what is the unique value of the data, or what is the unique data that you are capturing with your particular solution, who it's valuable to, and what you can do with it. Now, an interesting term was coined by our researchers last year. They Came down to Australia and spent a lot of time with a precision agriculture firm locally, going around to see what they were doing with IoT in farms down in Tasmania. And one of the terms that they crafted as a result of seeing what this particular company was doing with the data was the circulatory value of data. So that is the primary reason you're capturing this data in the first place may not be the end game in terms of how you monetize or value that data. That data set that you've created and accessed and now promoted out into the marketplace potentially could be of value to a number of other organisations when it's blended with their own data sets or tweaked in some way. So there are a number of ways to monetize this. So diagrammatically, I mean, this is how we lay out our platform, and I think most vendors that you'll speak to will have a similar view on how IoT infrastructure should look. As time's a little against me here, I won't go through every little widget within this, but just to touch on a couple of things to show you how a couple of those 5 tenets actually work their way through an IoT platform. If you consider security, so the left-hand side here, we're starting with the things. We're moving through into the cloud or the data center in the center, and then visualization of data and monetizing insight at the end there. And from the Intel perspective, trying to keep a consistent experience with security from the edge through to the cloud is absolutely imperative. So if you look at the gateway reference designs that we've created and promoted out into the market through a number of our ecosystem partners, they have a number of security features available to them in the hardware and in the software. So example, in the hardware, they have a unique hardware identifier that then would be recorded in the security policy for the cloud so that only that trusted gateway can attach to that particular cloud to do something. We have a thing called Secure Boot that we build into our transistors that ensures that as these devices are booting up, you can identify precisely what should be in that boot sequence and block out any nasties that are trying to get in below the BIOS. And then the software, there's things such as whitelisting. We acquired McAfee Security a number of years ago and are including some of their software in part of this infrastructure to ensure that when you're deploying agents onto these gateways, that the agents that you say should be activated and executed on these gateways is actually what's happening. And then on the edge, as well as into the depths of the data center, you have your analytics. And it's one thing we've noted here, and again, this is I think Cisco have a very similar view on this, is you don't need to send all the data that you're capturing into the cloud and into your analytics engine. Really what you're interested here are the changes in the data, the new trends that you're starting to pick up. So having some intelligence at the edge of your IoT system to actually pick up the data and determine whether this is something that should be kept at the edge or taken into the cloud and ingested into your big data analytics engine is a key feature of this. So food for thought. So now getting to, I guess, the pointy end here, and how do we start to monetize this? There's a number of waves that are going through IoT, both now and what we predict moving into the near-term future. So right now, we're very much in this bottom left-hand corner of the chart, connect and secure and manage. I think as an industry, we're very good at that now. We know how to manage these things and secure them, and certainly with the pervasiveness of cellular networks now and the like, we're very good at connecting things. We are now starting to see companies who are taking to market commercialised solutions for analysing, exposing data and insights for various verticals or for various functions, whether that be health, smart buildings, agriculture. And these guys are now starting to see real business starting to flow through from their unique solutions. Where we see this going as data sets become richer, as you're starting to blend the data sets that you're capturing with other data sets, as I mentioned, the circulatory value of data here, where monetization really starts to hit its straps, we feel, is when you are getting to the ability to predict. So you're able to predict health events, you'll be able to predict failure of engine parts, and be able to intervene before a critical event, which makes things much more efficient, much more practical, and a value that most people, industries, or or companies are prepared to pay for.